The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the wide open plains of the west. The air was hot, dry, and filled with the dust of 1,000 cattle hooves. Jack Holt, a rancher who had lived his entire life in this vast, untamed land, wiped the sweat from his brow as he surveyed the work ahead of him. It had been a long day and the sun was just beginning to set, signaling the end of another hard day's labor. Jack had spent most of his years working on the land, tending to his cattle, fixing fences, and ensuring the safety of his spread. He knew this land like the back of his hand, and it knew him just as well. He'd survived droughts, fires, and the rough, unforgiving nature of the West, but his most challenging moments had always been with the people around him. The West was full of unpredictable characters, many of them lawless, some dangerous, and only a few trustworthy. Yet through it all, Jack had managed to keep his ranch going, his head down, and his heart focused on the work that mattered most. As the last rays of sunlight stretched across the land, Jack's thoughts started to turn toward his evening routine. He planned to grab a quick meal at the small local saloon, just a few miles from his ranch. The little saloon, called the Dusty Boot, was the only place in town where ranchers, travelers, and locals gathered to share news, drink a beer, and relax after long days. Jack wasn't much for socializing, but he did enjoy the occasional drink, especially after a grueling day of hard work. His horse, a strong and reliable steed named Copper, was already tied to the post outside, ready to take him to the saloon for a moment of peace and quiet. Jack mounted Copper and kicked his heels gently into the horse's sides, guiding him toward the road that led into town. As they rode through the winding trails, Jack's mind wandered. He thought about the cattle he still needed to round up, the fence that was falling apart, and the endless chores that always seemed to pile up. He didn't mind the hard work. It was part of the life he had chosen. But at times, he wondered if it would ever get easier. Before long, the familiar buildings of the small town came into view, the roofs rising from the dusty earth like old friends in the distance. Jack rode Copper through the town's main street, nodding at a few of the familiar faces who were finishing up their daily routines. There wasn't much to the town, just a few houses, a general store, and of course the saloon. It wasn't the kind of place you'd see in the bigger cities, but it was home to the ranchers who worked the land and the outlaws who occasionally wandered through. When Jack arrived at the Dusty Boot, he dismounted from Copper and tied him to a hitching post outside. He didn't need to worry about his horse running off. Copper was as much a part of the ranch as Jack himself. Inside, the saloon was the same as it had always been, a place filled with the low hum of conversation, the sound of glasses clinking, and the scent of sweat and old wood. The wooden floors creaked underfoot as Jack stepped in, the swing of the door causing a brief hush before the conversation picked back up. Jack scanned the room for a familiar face, but it wasn't a crowded night. Most of the regulars had already finished their drinks and headed out. As he walked to the bar, he noticed a man he hadn't seen before sitting alone at a table. The man was dressed in a worn-out but well-kept brown jacket and a hat that shaded most of his face. He looked like someone who had been on the road for a long time. There was something about him, though, that caught Jack's attention. It wasn't the way he looked. No, there was something in his posture, the way he sat upright with a quiet but certain air about him. Jack didn't give it much thought. People wandered into town from time to time, and most of them just passed through without making much of an impact. But this man, something felt different. Jack ordered a drink from the bartender and took a seat at a corner table, his eyes glancing over to the stranger every now and then. The man at the table had a certain stillness about him, almost as if he were waiting for something. Jack took a slow sip of his whiskey, watching the man closely. It wasn't unusual for strangers to wander into town, but there was something about the way this one carried himself that made Jack uneasy. He wasn't sure why, but he had learned long ago to trust his instincts. The bartender, noticing Jack's curiosity, leaned over the bar. "That fellow over there?" the bartender whispered. "Just rode in this morning. Doesn't say much. Paid for a room upstairs, but he's been hanging around all day, staring out the window like he's waiting for someone." Jack frowned. He didn't like the sound of that. It was the kind of talk that often led to trouble, especially in a place like this. The West wasn't kind to those who didn't mind their own business, and Jack wasn't the type to get involved in things that weren't his concern. But there was something about this man that nagged at him, the quiet intensity in his eyes, the way he carried himself like a man who had seen more than his share of trouble. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this stranger was up to something. He glanced over at the man again, and just as he did, their eyes met. The stranger didn't look away, but instead, his lips curled into a slight, almost amused smile. Jack didn't know what to make of it. Was this a challenge? A warning? Or simply the stranger's way of passing the time? The bartender poured another drink and slid it toward Jack. "You think he's trouble?" Jack asked, still eyeing the man across the room. The bartender shrugged. "Could be. You know how it goes. These folks who come from nowhere, they always have a reason. Ain't no one just passing through the way he is." Jack took another sip of his drink. He didn't know what the man wanted, but one thing was clear. He wasn't here for no good reason. And Jack Holt had lived too long on these unforgiving plains not to know when trouble was coming. It wasn't long before the man stood up from his table, walked to the bar, and ordered a drink. Jack watched him closely, his hand resting near his side where his revolver was tucked under his jacket. The man paid the bartender with a $1, and Jack couldn't help but notice the way the stranger's eyes flicked toward him for just a moment as he handed over the coin. The exchange was brief, but Jack had a feeling it wasn't the last time their paths would cross. As the man turned and made his way toward the back of the saloon, Jack finished his drink, stood up, and walked out onto the porch. The cool night air greeted him, and for the first time in a long while he felt a shiver run down his spine. The night was about to get interesting. The evening grew darker, and the atmosphere inside the dusty boot began to shift. The faint sounds of a few late-night conversations mixed with the clinking of glasses, and the soft murmur of a guitar being played in the corner by a local who was looking to make a few extra coins. Jack leaned against the wooden rail of the saloon's porch, his eyes still focused on the figure of the stranger inside. Something felt off. Maybe it was the way the man moved. Too sure of himself, or the way he scanned the room, sizing people up. It wasn't the look of someone simply passing through. It was the look of someone with a plan. Jack took a deep breath and looked out across the street. The dim glow from the lamps cast long shadows on the dirt road. The town was quiet now, most of the locals tucked away in their homes, likely getting ready for bed after another day in the harsh, dry heat of the West. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. He was used to trusting his instincts. It was something that had kept him alive through many a tough situation. And right now his gut was telling him that trouble was coming. He was about to step back inside when the door of the saloon swung open behind him. Jack turned to see the stranger walking out. The man paused just outside the door, took a long look at the quiet street, and then his eyes found Jack's. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Two men staring each other down, each measuring the other up. Then the stranger spoke. "You the rancher that runs things around here?" His voice was smooth, calm, almost casual, but there was a sharp edge to it, like the man had done his fair share of talking to men who didn't take too kindly to strangers. Jack studied him for a moment before responding. "I'm just a man trying to keep my land in one piece. What's it to you?" The stranger chuckled, a low sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just wondering. Seems like a good place for a man with $1 to spend." He paused, almost like he was waiting for Jack to react. "How about it? You think you've got what it takes to take a shot for $1? Jack's brow furrowed, confusion flickering in his eyes. "A shot?" he repeated, not quite sure what the man meant. The stranger's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Yeah, a draw. You and me, one shot. I pay you $1 for the chance." Jack felt a flicker of recognition. A draw. He had heard the stories. Men challenging each other in showdowns, drawing their guns faster than the eye could follow. It was the kind of thing that happened in places like this. But Jack wasn't interested in getting caught up in some fool's game. He had a ranch to run, cattle to tend to, and a life that didn't have room for pointless challenges. "Listen," Jack said slowly, his voice steady. "I don't play games like that. If you've come all this way to make trouble, you'd best find it somewhere else." The stranger's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Jack saw a flicker of something darker, something that suggested the man wasn't used to being turned down. The stranger took a step closer, his boots scraping softly against the dirt. "I've got $1. You don't have to do anything except take the shot. One shot, that's all. Don't you want to prove something?" The challenge hung in the air between them, thick and heavy. Jack stood there, weighing the options in his mind. He wasn't a man to back down from a challenge, But he also knew better than to let pride take the wheel. In this life, pride could be a dangerous thing. But there was something about the way this man spoke, the way he moved, that made Jack think it wasn't just about the dollar. "You think $1 is going to make me pull my gun?" Jack asked, his voice growing quieter. The stranger didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a coin, flipping it between his fingers with an air of confidence. Then, without looking at Jack, he placed the dollar on the wooden railing beside them. "I'll pay you this, and I'll bet you can't make the shot. What do you say, rancher?" Jack's fingers twitched. He had heard of men like this before. Dangerous, unpredictable, and looking for a way to prove themselves. But it wasn't the kind of thing Jack wanted to get wrapped up in. He wasn't some young fool with something to prove. He was a man of the land. His hands had known hard work all his life, not gambling on quick draws. But the stranger's words had struck something inside of him. It wasn't about the dollar. It wasn't about showing off. But there was a part of Jack that felt the challenge call out to him. "You're wasting your time," Jack finally said, his eyes cold and steady. "But if you're set on it, we can do it your way." The stranger raised an eyebrow, surprised that Jack hadn't backed down. "You sure you're up for it?" Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up the dollar from the rail, letting the smooth paper sit in his palm for a moment before looking back at the stranger. "Let's make it simple," Jack said. "You get one shot. And if I win, you leave this town. Understand?" The stranger's smile returned, a little more genuine this time. "That's more like it." He reached into his coat, pulling out a revolver and twirling it with the same casual grace that Jack had seen earlier. But Jack didn't flinch. He wasn't impressed by the man's bravado. He had faced tougher men before. With a final glance toward the town behind them, Jack unbuckled his own revolver. The cold metal felt familiar in his hand, a part of him that had always been there. Quiet, powerful, ready for whatever came next. As they stood there, the world seemed to fall away. The street was empty, the lights from the saloon casting long shadows on the dusty ground. The moment had arrived. The challenge was set, and now there was no turning back. The man took a step back, his eyes never leaving Jack. "Ready?" he asked. Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he focused on the task at hand. He had no need to make a show of it, no need for bravado, just the calm, steady hand of a man who had spent his life learning the art of survival. With the weight of the moment heavy between them, Jack knew that this wasn't just about the dollar anymore. It was about something deeper, something that could only be settled by a single shot. The air around them was thick with tension, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Jack's heart beat steadily in his chest. His eyes focused on the man standing just a few feet away. The stranger had not moved since Jack had agreed to the challenge. His eyes were locked on Jack's, a silent dare hanging between them like the calm before a storm. The night was eerily quiet. No wind, no sound from the town, just the low murmur from the saloon behind them. It felt as though time itself had slowed down. Jack's hand rested lightly on the grip of his revolver, the cold steel familiar under his fingertips. He didn't need to look down. He had done this 1,000 times before. His hand knew the weapon as well as he knew the land he worked. The revolver wasn't just an object to him. It was an extension of himself, a tool that had kept him alive through thick and thin. He had no intentions of drawing it quickly or recklessly, but when the time came, he would not hesitate. He had learned long ago that hesitation could be deadly. The stranger, however, had the look of a man who didn't quite understand hesitation. He was still twirling his revolver in his hand, spinning it casually like it was a toy rather than a weapon. His eyes never left Jack, and there was a slight smirk on his lips, as if he thought the whole thing was some sort of game. Jack didn't know who this man was, but he could sense that this was no ordinary cowboy. This was someone who had seen his fair share of fights and probably more than a few gunfights. And yet Jack wasn't afraid. He had faced down enough dangerous men in his life to know that it wasn't always the fastest hand that won the fight. It was the smartest. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the stranger spoke again, his voice low and steady. "You've got the look of a man who's seen trouble before, rancher. You sure you want to do this?" Jack didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, his eyes locked on the stranger's. There was no need to answer. His silence said everything. The stranger's challenge had been accepted, and now there was nothing left to do but finish it. The man, sensing the finality of Jack's silence, took a deep breath and raised his arm slightly. "All right then. We'll do this simple," the stranger said, his smirk widening. "One shot, no tricks. Whoever draws first gets the $1. Jack nodded once, a small but deliberate movement. He wasn't here for any games or tricks. If it came down to a draw, it would be an honest one. It always had to be. Both men stood facing each other a mere few paces apart. Jack could feel the heat of the night air on his skin, the quiet pressure of the moment building with every passing second. His gaze never wavered from the stranger's eyes. He wasn't looking at the revolver the man held. He wasn't looking for any signs of movement in the stranger's body language. He was looking at the man's eyes because that's where the truth always lay. The eyes were the first to betray a man's intentions. Jack wasn't an expert in reading every subtle gesture, but he knew one thing. In a standoff like this, the person who hesitated, even for the briefest moment, would lose. This wasn't about speed alone, it was about focus, calmness, and confidence. The stranger's fingers twitched slightly around the grip of his revolver. Jack noticed the small movement, but he didn't react. His hand remained steady at his side, his body perfectly still. Jack was in no hurry. He had trained himself to wait, to allow the moment to unfold as it would. This wasn't a race. It was a contest of patience. The saloon door opened behind them, but neither man turned to look. The few remaining patrons inside had gathered by the window, peeking out, watching the showdown unfold with wide eyes. Jack could feel the weight of their gaze, but it didn't matter. He was beyond caring what anyone else thought. The only thing that mattered now was the stranger in front of him. "Ready?" the stranger asked again, his voice just a little more tense this time. Jack nodded slowly, his face unreadable. The air between them seemed to pulse with electricity. The night had turned as still as death, and the only sound was the distant rumble of a horse's hooves somewhere far down the road. And then, without warning, the stranger's hand moved in a blur. The revolver came up with lightning speed, the barrel aimed directly at Jack's chest. Jack's instincts kicked in instantly. His hand shot down to his own holster, fingers finding the grip of his revolver with practiced ease. His body was already in motion before the stranger's gun even left his hand. Jack's revolver was out and aimed in one smooth motion, but he wasn't looking at the barrel. He was watching the stranger's face. He saw the brief flicker of surprise in the man's eyes when he realized that Jack had already drawn. It was the smallest of pauses, a hesitation just long enough for Jack to make his move. In that split second, Jack's finger pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot rang out loud and sharp in the quiet night air. It was a clean, perfect shot, and it hit its mark with deadly accuracy. The stranger's gun dropped from his hand, his arm hanging limp at his side. He staggered backward a step, his eyes wide with disbelief. Jack stood perfectly still, his revolver still aimed at the man's chest. The world seemed to pause once again, the weight of the moment hanging heavily between them. The stranger looked down at his hand, still twitching from the impact of the shot, before slowly looking back up at Jack. For a long moment, the two men stood there, neither of them speaking. The saloon had fallen completely silent. The patrons watched, breathless, as the stranger finally dropped to his knees. His face was a mask of shock, his pride shattered in an instant. Jack holstered his gun slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving the stranger. He didn't have to say anything. The message had been clear. The stranger, his voice shaky, finally broke the silence. "I didn't think you'd be that fast," he muttered, a mixture of awe and bitterness in his tone. His hand hovered near his wounded arm, but he made no attempt to move it. Jack didn't respond. He wasn't here to talk. He wasn't here for any more games. He had proven his point. With a final steady glance, Jack turned and began walking back toward the saloon. The evening wasn't over, but the challenge had been settled. The rancher had taken his shot, and it had been true. Behind him, the stranger sat on the ground, his head bowed in defeat, realizing that he had just encountered a man who wasn't interested in showdowns or dollar bills. He was simply a man who had learned to survive in a world where only the strongest, most focused men walked away. The sound of the gunshot still hung in the air, its echo slowly fading away like the last whispers of a storm. Jack stood motionless, his revolver now safely holstered at his side. The saloon was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that only came after something significant had happened. The patrons who had been watching the standoff with bated breath now seemed unsure of what to do. Some of them glanced nervously at each other. Others stood frozen in their spots. No one spoke, as though the weight of the moment had left them all unsure of how to react. Jack didn't wait for the others. He had already made his decision. His attention was fully on the stranger, who was now sitting on the ground, still reeling from the impact of the shot. His gun was lying on the dusty street far from his reach. The man's face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. His pride had taken a blow, one far heavier than the wound on his arm. The stranger looked up at Jack, his lips trembling as he tried to form words. He seemed unable to speak, too stunned by the speed of Jack's draw. Jack had done what most men only dreamed of doing. He had stood still, waited for the right moment, and then made a single clean shot that ended the challenge before it even had a chance to escalate. For a moment, Jack thought the man might say something, maybe beg for mercy, maybe offer an excuse, but instead the stranger remained silent, his gaze locked on Jack's eyes. It was the kind of look that seemed to ask why. Why had this happened? Why had Jack been so calm, so controlled when the stranger had expected a battle, a showdown of willpower? Jack had seen this before. There were always men who came looking for a fight, who thought they could outdraw someone else, but they never understood the most important part of a standoff. It wasn't about speed. It wasn't about bravado. It was about control, focus, and patience. Jack had learned that through years of living on the edge of danger. He had been in enough situations where everything could go wrong in the blink of an eye. And he had survived all those moments not because he was the fastest, but because he was the one who never lost his nerve. The silence stretched on, and Jack's thoughts moved to other things. He thought about his ranch, about the cattle he needed to round up and the endless tasks that lay ahead of him. The moment had passed, and now it was time to leave. There was no need to drag it out any longer. No need to gloat, no need to rub it in. The stranger had been bested, and Jack had done what he needed to do. That was enough. With a deliberate motion, Jack turned to walk back into the saloon. His boots kicked up a small cloud of dust as he made his way toward the door. The hinges creaked as he pushed it open, stepping inside where the warm glow of the lanterns bathed the room in a soft, golden light. A few patrons had already gone back to their drinks, trying to act as though nothing unusual had happened. But the tension in the air was thick. Everyone knew what had just taken place. They had witnessed something that most people only heard about in stories. Two men face to face with the fate of their pride resting on a single shot. Jack didn't care about the attention. He didn't care about the whispers that might follow. He had made his choice, and now he was going to stick to it. As he walked toward the bar, the bartender gave him a nod. Jack didn't need to say anything. There was no need for words now. His actions had spoken louder than any conversation could. He ordered a drink, his hand resting on the edge of the counter. His mind wandered back to the man outside. Jack wasn't the type to take pleasure in the defeat of others, but he understood something very important about the stranger. The man had come to town with a challenge, but he had been unprepared for the reality of what that challenge meant. Jack knew that some men couldn't help but test their limits. They thought they could outdraw someone faster or smarter than themselves. They didn't realize that it wasn't just about winning, it was about understanding your own limitations. The stranger had failed to do that, and that failure had cost him. Jack's drink arrived, a simple glass of whiskey. He took it in hand, swirled it gently, and took a slow sip. The warm liquid burned its way down his throat, settling in his stomach. There was a certain comfort in that burn, a reminder that he was still here, still standing, still doing what he had always done. Surviving outside, the stranger had finally risen to his feet, though he was clearly still dazed. Jack could hear the faint sounds of footsteps as the man slowly walked back toward the saloon. He wasn't making a scene, but it was clear that he wasn't ready to accept defeat so easily. Jack didn't care. Let him figure it out on his own. This wasn't Jack's fight anymore. The challenge had been settled, and that was the end of it. As the man entered the saloon, he walked past Jack, his gaze avoiding contact. Jack could feel the eyes of the other patrons on them, but he didn't look up. He didn't need to. The stranger had lost, and that was something he would have to come to terms with. Jack wasn't going to waste time trying to console him. The man stopped at the bar a few feet away and ordered a drink. His voice was hoarse, as though he was still recovering from the shock of the encounter. He glanced at Jack, but Jack didn't meet his gaze. Instead, he took another sip of his whiskey, the cold glass providing a small sense of calm. He could feel the weight of the situation slowly lifting off his shoulders. It was then that the stranger spoke again, his voice quieter this time, but with a certain weight to it. "You've got skills, rancher," he said, his words heavy with respect. "I'll give you that. I didn't think you'd be that fast. I underestimated you." Jack didn't look up, but he could tell that the stranger's words weren't just about the gunfight. They were about something deeper, something that the man had realized in that brief, intense moment. Jack had shown him something. It wasn't just about being fast with a gun. It was about being prepared, being aware, and knowing when to act. The stranger had been out of his depth from the beginning, and now he knew it. With a final, quiet nod, the man turned and walked out of the saloon. Jack didn't follow. He didn't need to. The standoff had ended, and now it was over. There was no more to be said. As Jack finished his drink, he felt the weight of the day lift from his shoulders. It wasn't that the fight had been easy or that it had come without cost. It was that it had been necessary. The West wasn't kind to men who weren't prepared to face it head-on. And Jack Holt had learned long ago that you didn't survive here by backing down. You survived by staying calm, staying focused, and being ready when the time came. And now, as the saloon settled back into its usual rhythm, Jack allowed himself a quiet sigh of relief. Another day done, another challenge faced, and once again he had come out on top. The evening rolled on like the quiet after a storm, the atmosphere inside the dusty boot beginning to settle back into its usual rhythm. The murmur of conversation returned, the low hum of voices blending with the soft clinking of glasses. The tension from the standoff had started to dissipate, but Jack could still feel the weight of the moment in the air. His mind was clear now, though. The challenge was over, the dust had settled, and he was still standing. Jack didn't need to think about it any more than he already had. He had done what he needed to do. In the wild, unpredictable world of the West, there were many ways a man could lose his life. Some of them came from the elements, droughts, wildfires, or even a stampede of cattle. But other dangers came from the men around you. Men like the stranger who thought they could prove themselves by testing others. Jack had been through enough of that in his life to know that it was always better to face those challenges head-on than to let them grow into something more dangerous. The bartender wiped down the counter with a rag, casting a glance over to Jack. The man had seen more than his fair share of gunfights and showdowns, but he didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. In a place like this, you didn't talk about things like that unless you had to. Jack had proven his point, and there was no need for any more words. Jack took a final sip of his drink, the warmth spreading through his chest. He wasn't much for talking after something like this. The saloon had quieted down, the other patrons going back to their business, but he noticed a few eyes still lingering on him. He wasn't bothered by it. People in places like this were always watching, always curious about the outcome of things like this. But that was part of the deal. Jack wasn't here to entertain anyone or make a spectacle. He was here to live his life and survive, the same way he had done every day for as long as he could remember. He stood up, placing his glass back down on the bar. The man who had challenged him was long gone, disappearing into the night without another word. Jack didn't know what would become of him. Maybe he'd find his way, maybe he wouldn't, but that wasn't Jack's concern. He had enough of his own life to worry about. He was a rancher, not a savior. As Jack stepped out of the saloon, the cool night air hit him, a refreshing contrast to the warm, stuffy atmosphere inside. The town was still, and the stars above sparkled brightly in the clear sky. It was the kind of night that made everything feel peaceful, despite the violence that had just taken place. Jack looked out at the empty street for a moment, the silence almost comforting. It was as if the whole town had been holding its breath, waiting for the showdown to be over. He made his way back to where Copper, his horse, was tied up. The horse stood patiently, its head held high, ready to go. Jack smiled softly to himself. Copper was a good horse, always reliable, always there when he needed him. The rancher patted the horse's neck before mounting him. It had been a long day, and Jack was ready to return to his land where the work never stopped. As he rode through the quiet town, his thoughts drifted to the morning. There would be more cattle to tend to, more fences to repair, more land to manage. That was the life he had chosen, and he had no intention of changing it. Jack had never been one for idle chatter or grand ambitions. He didn't need much, just his land, his animals, and the peace that came from knowing he had earned every inch of it. But the West was always changing. Every day brought something new, something unexpected. And while Jack didn't welcome the chaos, he had learned long ago that it was part of the package. Life in these parts wasn't easy, and it wasn't meant to be. If you wanted to survive, you had to be tough, patient, and ready to face whatever came your way. He reached the outskirts of town, where the open plains stretched out in front of him. The night air was cooler here, the sound of the wind rustling through the tall grass a welcome change from the noisy, crowded saloon. Jack slowed Copper to a walk, allowing the horse to take its time as they made their way back to the ranch. The journey back was peaceful, and for a moment, Jack allowed himself to relax. He had won today, but tomorrow would bring new challenges. That was the way life worked out here. His thoughts turned to the stranger. What would happen to him now? Jack wasn't sure. He had seen men like him before, drifters, wanderers who came into town looking for a fight or a way to prove themselves. They thought they could test their luck, challenge someone like Jack, and walk away feeling better about themselves. But most of them didn't realize that the West was a place that didn't take kindly to arrogance. Jack had spent years learning how to survive in this unforgiving land, and he knew that you couldn't just walk in, make a challenge, and expect to win. The stranger had learned that the hard way. Jack hadn't been looking for a fight, but when the challenge had come, he had met it head-on, with no hesitation. It wasn't about the dollar, and it wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about survival, doing what needed to be done to make sure you lived to see another day. As Jack rode through the quiet night, he couldn't help but think about how different the stranger's life might have been if he had understood that lesson sooner. The West wasn't a place where men could afford to be reckless. It was a place where you had to think before you acted, where you had to stay calm and patient even when everything around you screamed for action. Jack had learned that lesson through years of experience. He had learned that patience, discipline, and control were the keys to making it in the harsh, unforgiving world of the West, and tonight, he had proved that once again. He arrived at the ranch just as the stars above were starting to shine brighter in the night sky. The silhouette of the ranch house stood against the horizon, a familiar sight. Jack dismounted Copper and led him into the stable, where the horse settled into its stall with a satisfied grunt. Jack brushed down the horse before heading into the house. Inside, the warmth of the fire greeted him. It was a simple home, nothing fancy, but it was his. It was the place where he could rest, regroup, and prepare for the next day. As he sat down at the table, Jack reflected on the events of the day. He had faced a challenge and come out on top, but there was no sense of victory. It wasn't about pride or glory. It was about survival. And in the West, that was all that mattered. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Jack leaned back in his chair, his mind at ease for the first time that day. The world outside was still wild and untamed, but in this moment he was at peace. Tomorrow, he would rise with the sun, ready to face whatever came next. The West was never going to slow down, and neither was Jack. But tonight he had earned his rest.